This is Keith.
And this is Ben. And this is Main Street Lutherans. Today, we're going to talk about the Churchwide Church, the ELCA at the national level. And we've got a special guest, Imran Siddiqui. He's actually here with us right now as we're talking. So welcome, Imran.
Thank you for having me.
So Keith, how many interactions have you had with the ELCA headquarters?
Oh, golly. And there was that incident with the fire. No, I don't think I've had any. No.
Well, I'll tell you, I've had a few, but the main one that I remember is I was actually interviewing in 1997 to be the webmaster for the ELCA. That was quite an interesting journey. Ended up not being able to make my interview because I had to say yes to a different job before I could take that one. So
I remember that. I'd completely forgotten about that.
Yeah, a whole thing about getting a flight, and the guy I worked with only worked a couple days a week, so it just didn't work out. So how much do you think your average parishioner in your church understands how the national church operates?
Operates probably minimal. I think that we've got, people that would recognize wings and arms. They might know about, they probably know that we have a presiding bishop. They may or may not be able to identify who that person is at the moment. They probably have they've certainly heard of Lutheran Disaster Response and the ELCA World Hunger, because we make regular, plugs for those ministries. Mm-hmm. They've probably heard of some of the, para ELCA or organizations that the ELCA relates to, like Lutheran Portable Belief. But beyond that, I don't know. I don't know. They may know a little bit more about the synod that we're in, but again, not too very much.
Yeah, I don't think the church at Unity, I think we've got one person who works closely with a few different wings, but in general, it's kind of hard to get your mind wrapped around, just because it's not in our faces every day or even every week. Mm-hmm. So, well, we have with us today, as I said, Imran Siddiqui, Vice President of the ELCA. We're so glad to have you here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here myself.
Yeah. So, as the Vice President, what does that mean, and what got you into this whole thing in the first place?
Yeah, you've been in this role for about a year now, right?
Almost two.
Gosh. Okay.
So I started November 1st, 22. I was elected at the Churchwide Assembly in Columbus, in 2022. And what got me into this was, I guess, an inability not to say yes. And so, as many of us end up in places we end up. So before being in this role, I was the vice president of the Southeastern Synod of the ELCA, which is a synod that incorporates the states of Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. And I'd been there for about 4 years. I just got reelected again. And, there was an election coming up in 2022. I don't know if you recall, but the previous elected vice president was a man named Bill Horn. He passed away, unfortunately, before his term was up. And then Carlos Pena, who was a former two-term ELCA vice president, came on to be interim vice president. And he was not interested in running again. And so it was a wide open process. And this was the first time that the vice president of the ELCA was done by a pre-identification process. And so the idea was everyone that goes to the Churchwide Assembly gets to nominate up to 3 people for the role that they want. When someone nominated me, at first I asked my bishop, I said, "Are you trying to get rid of me? Was this you?" And he said, "It wasn't me." And so I thought about it, and I said, because of, everyone gets to nominate 3 folks, and they have to be lay people. The vice president of the ELCA always has to be a lay person. And so I said, well, there's probably a lot of people going to be nominated. Let me just fill out this bio form, and most, hopefully I'll get enough support. I can go on stage and talk for 4 minutes or something. So to my surprise, there were only 13 people that had filled out the bio form. That came out about a month before the assembly. I told my wife, I said, don't worry. No one's going to pick me. No one knows me. It's not going to happen.
To be fair, did anyone know any of the other nominees?
Well, some of the other nominees had been around in their positions for quite a while.
Okay.
A lot of the other nominees were vice presidents of synods. Some of them had been in their second or third term as vice presidents of synods, had been working with, people around the country. Now, granted, I mean, that's a good question, because the question is, how much do people know about the folks that are working in various things and in,
Hmm.
social statement task forces, or, doing things with other, synods and things of that nature. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're very atomized. So, the thing is, then I went to Columbus, and the first ballot, I think I was second, and I said, uh-oh. And then after the third ballot, I was first by like 100 votes, and I said, uh-oh. That's when I kind of knew.
Were you wearing scarlet and gray? Because that does really well in Columbus.
Actually, I was not. I think on the day that I was elected, it was a Thursday, so it was Thursdays in Black, which is a World Council of Churches program to cast light on victims of abuse, women of abuse. So I was wearing black and I was wearing red pants. So I don't know if that's close
It's
enough.
pretty close. It's better than, yeah,
I wasn't wearing blue and yellow. I
and
should.
yellow. Yeah.
Right.
So that would do still pretty well in November in Columbus.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was how when I got elected to the role, and it was a surprise to me, and I don't know, like most other people, I knew of the Churchwide organization, right? But I didn't really know it. I knew that
Right.
we have Bishop Eaton, who's the presiding bishop. I knew there's the secretary, Sue Rothmeyer, you know, and I knew that there was an organization up there. But, aside from that, I couldn't tell you much more. So it was an interesting learning curve and about getting in there after that. So that was how I became the vice president of the ELCA. And then I, had some talks with Carlos Pena to say, so what is this? So I should say the vice president of the ELCA, in a certain way, is similar to the vice president of a synod, in that the role of the vice president of the ELCA is to chair the ELCA Church Council. And that's it. That's constitutionally it, basically.
Mm.
That's the main role. The ELCA Church Council, and this is the whatever technical term, but the highest legislative body in the ELCA between churchwide assemblies. What that means is that everything the churchwide assembly does and passes, the church council has to kind of put into practice and have to figure out how to do it, right? It's easy enough for an assembly to say, we're going to be this. It's the church council kind of has to figure out, all right, so who are we going to send that to work on this, to figure out how we can do this, right? So that's a lot of the work that the church council does. The church council's not sitting there going, all right, how can we make up new things and do weird stuff? It's mostly, how can we do what the church wants us to do based on what they voted on at the assembly? Now, the vice president, of course, as I mentioned, always has to be a layperson. So the ELCA vice president is technically the highest lay person in the church, and one of the four officers of the church, with the presiding bishop, the secretary, and the treasurer. In your synods, right, the vice president, similar, is the highest layperson in your synod. They chair the synod council, and synod councils have a slightly, I guess I should say, it's a little different because a lot of synods have assemblies every year. So
Yeah.
it's kind of but in the churchwide organization, it's every 3 years, which makes it kind of a little bit interesting in that respect. But the term is 6 years, as well as any other officer, and as well as any churchwide or any ELCA church council person is elected to 6 years. So, and I think of the officers, it's a 6-year term. There's no term limit, but usually a lot of people say, you know what, 2 terms, 12 years is enough.
Mm.
Yeah. So the rest of the church council's elected at Churchwide the same way.
So they're elected in a little different way, right? So the officers are elected in this kind of 5 ballot process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you have an ecclesiastical ballot on the first one, where you write down anyone that qualifies, right? So for vice president, you can write down any layperson in the church. Rick Steves got votes, for example.
Sure.
And so then it whittles down, right? Then the second ballot is whoever was listed on the first ballot who didn't pull their name out. Third ballot is the top 7. So it goes to top 7, then it goes to top 3, and then it goes to top 2.
Unless somebody gets a majority, right?
Well, it's not a majority. So the
Okay.
first ballot 75%,
It changes each one.
ballot 60, and it's a super majority up to the point where, the final ballot is the majority one. Church council, if you've ever been in churchwide assembly, there's a long ballot of names. And I forget the exact name of this ballot, but it has church council members, it has committee members, it has, there's like 100 different ballots. And you're supposed to go down, you're supposed to pick a individual on each ballot. Every part, or most parts, have someone running against them. And for church council, what happens is there are 65 synods, there are 35 elected positions, and then there might be some at-larges. But all the synods kind of take turns. So you're paired up with another synod. So, for example, Southeastern Synod is paired up with South Carolina Synod. So for one 6-year term, South Carolina gets to pick. And in their synod assembly, they pick 2 nominees for the churchwide assembly to pick from. 6 years after that 6 years is up, it goes back to the Southeastern Synod, who gets to pick 2 people to send to churchwide assembly for everyone to vote on. And they vote on basically a bioform. And if you think about it, that's like 200 bioforms for everyone to read to make the decisions on who to pick. It's a lot. It's a lot. And I thought about, there has to be a better way, but then I'm also like, yeah, I guess if we had like a 2-week assembly, maybe, but.
Well, and that's a 35-person church council?
Well, it's more than that, because there's been at-larges added, right? So it's over 40. I think it's closer to 45.
Wow.
Yeah, there have been some at-larges added just to make sure that things are balanced in different ways. And so the people that decide how many is the actual church council will decide, do we need any more at-larges for various reasons?
Sure.
So,
okay.
Wow. Well, that's a lot to manage as far as people.
Right.
That's not your more normal committee to wrangle, if you will.
No. And of course, then you walk in the middle, right? Because they have, every churchwide assembly picks like, I don't know, a third or whatever it is of it. And so you have people that have been there for 3 years when you walk in,
Mm-hmm.
and you got to know those folks. And then you got the new people that come in that year. And so, yeah, I heard in the past, it was a lot easier when churchwide assemblies were every 2 years, because you were able to have the overlapping, things going on. Whereas the every 3 years means invariably the folks that have been on, say, executive committees will all leave at the same time. So,
yeah. So speaking of wrangling a lot, the things that, and I know this is a very generalized kind of question, but the things that the churchwide assembly, does and passes, and then the church council is responsible for figuring out, what kinds of things are these? These, I think for the sake of our listeners are going to be curious, are these like theological discussions? Are these administrative policies? Are these like social justice issues?
Well, generally speaking, they can be all of those, right? So I'll give you some examples, what the churchwide assembly did last time in 2022. One of the things that they passed was they wanted a DEIA audit of the governing documents, right? So that's an administrative, how do we do this? Mm-hmm. They also passed something to look at on leave from call status. There was a passing, and so those things are more administrative. So the church council has done, so on leave from call, there's a task force that was set up to look at this and propose changes for the next churchwide assembly. And so when we meet in November, we'll get kind of some of the recommendations from that committee, from that task force. The DEIA audit, the church council went to an attorney in the Chicago area to go look at these documents and find out where we can improve or increase kind of diversity, equity, inclusion information. And so that person came up with recommendations. That's being looked at by the Constitutional law committee of the church council. So those things are done that way. And then there was a resolution passed to look at the human sexuality gift and trust social statement. And so church council working with, so first send it off to the theological and ethics folks at Churchwide to create a task force in order to look at these things and come back. So that's a theological base. And so operational, theological, and what was, I had another example
Uh,
of the one you said.
yeah. Administrative or policy.
Yeah. So, and then, policy wise, like there are things such as there are things that are passed saying that the ELCA should, for example, advocate for, I think there was something where advocate for voting, for increased voting laws, like the John Lewis Voting Act, things of that nature. And
Yeah.
so, the church council will refer that to the presiding bishop, and the presiding bishop will decide, what's the best way to go about it. Might be through advocacy arms of the ELCA, might be something that she says herself, those sort of things. But for all of the questions, like all of those apply in different ways. There are some things, that people want to pass, and because of the way we're organized, some things get kind of confused and they don't end up being the way that some people think they are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the jobs of the church council to figure out, okay, how can we do some of these things, and how can we do them in accordance with how our Constitution exists in the present moment? Because we can't do anything that goes beyond what we're allowed to do. And so that's kind of one of the goals. The church council is, tasked with how can we do this, and how can we not, be in violation of our Constitution at the same time.
Mm.
So those are the official
Thanks.
things.
Yeah.
But you're out there doing stuff. Maybe I just didn't notice it before, but you're out there doing stuff. You were at the youth gathering, making videos and TikToks with them. You've got stuff on Facebook every week, and you're interacting on Reddit. All that stuff. So that seems like an awful lot of additional things to take on, and I'm not sure if anybody had done that before.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I do know Bill Horn did go to a youth gathering. I do know that. But and so I was one of the things when I came in, I was like, okay, I know my official role is this, right? But really, I kind of want to do more than just that. What is it? It's 2 meetings a year. With church council meets 2 meetings a year. Executive committee of church council meets on Zoom once a month, right? I'm like, I was thinking that it should be a little more than that. And one of the things I was thinking is, what do I want from someone that's an officer of the ELCA? And I was thinking about, and I said, one of the problems with the churchwide organization that people talk about is kind of a lack of transparency. Like we talked about, what, people don't know
Sure.
what exactly is the churchwide organization doing, or who are the officers, and what are they doing. So I said, all right, how about I'll be more public presenting to just talk to folks and figure out, what's on their mind, what's going on in the church, and they can pick my mind if they want to, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But just to be kind of open and available for people, just to have someone that they can bounce questions off and figure out things about. So I said, what are the ways I can do that? I mean, I was already on Reddit, so I figured, I can just keep posting on Reddit. I kept a low profile for a while though afterwards, but, and then, I had a Facebook page, and I thought I had a meeting with the folks at Strategic Communications, right? And I was like, okay, so, and a lot of the conversation that I was planning on having was, okay, how can we be more open as a church to what we're doing, telling people what, the church council is doing, what Conference of Bishops is doing. And what they, in this conversation, said, well, before Bill Horn passed away, he was thinking of having a public Facebook page. And he said, would you be interested in that? And I said, oh, sure. First I was like, let me think about it. And I said, you know what? Election season is coming up soon, and I don't want my personal page to be, associated with a church-wide, position, and be talking about politics or partisan politics at the same time. So I said, give me an official page so I can separate, kind of those two aspects. And so we worked on that. We got that set up. And then, for a little bit, I did small things, and I thought about, what are ways I can engage with people, because when I got elected, one of the things I really wanted to do was to open a channel for people to have conversations so that they know that people in a churchwide position are listening to them and are, engaging in the issues that they're dealing with. And so I said, all right, let me just figure out ways to do that. And so I've settled on, I post at least 3 times a week. I ask a question on Mondays, and this Monday, was I think it was something related to what was written in the lectionary. So sometimes I pull from that. Sometimes I pull from holidays, asking what the church can do to support workers on Labor Day, right?
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
and then on Wednesdays, I ask, can, what do you need prayer for? And then on Fridays, where did you see God this week? And then every once in a while, I'll post about something else, either that's coming from the Churchwide Facebook or something that I just was on my mind or something. So, and then, people will engage with it. And sometimes people get mad and sometimes people appreciate it, but sometimes it gets heated.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's the church.
Mhm.
The first time I saw your
And
question,
it's
where
Facebook.
did you see God at work this week? I thought you meant at work. Where did you see God? And so when I saw it the second time, I thought, that's not what he's asking.
I mean, it could be.
Right.
It's your interpretation, I'm
That's
not
right.
I'm not going for a literal interpretation of my question.
Yeah. Well, and in that case, it fit. So I answered that first time, and then wondered why you were asking again the next week. And like, ah, God talks a lot at work.
Right.
Can do, yeah.
Yeah.
But I've also done other things. I've been invited to various other. I mean, I met Keith at Lower Susquehanna Synod had a clergy wellness. I don't know. It was a weekend, I think,
Yeah.
and Bishop Dunlop said, "Hey, do you want to come up for this? We'll cover your expenses and you can talk about it." And I said, "Oh, sure." And so, well, one of the things I found is a good way to talk with folks, right? So
Mhm.
I mean, they just set it up as a Q&A. I mean, I just talked a little bit about, my past, and I think I talked for 10 minutes about it, and then I opened it up as a Q&A because I'm interested in having those type of conversations. And I thought this was a great place, especially it was, I mean, very clergy focused and, you know, clergy these days have a lot of questions about how the church is transitioning and changing and what role is going to be there for them. And so I thought that was a very interesting and very fruitful conversation. And I'm very quick to say when I don't know something, right? So,
Mhm.
I mean, I think that it helps for us to be actually talking about these things, even if we don't know where we're going. At least it's on our mind. So I've done things like that, and I love doing kind of Q&A stuff. So
Yeah, and I think you're right. From where I was sitting in the room, it seemed to me like people were interested in hearing from someone who knows a little bit about what's going on at Churchwide, because you know pastors are probably more in tune with those movements than lay people are in our congregations. And yet, I'll speak for myself. I know a lot of generalities. I don't know a lot of specifics. And so to be able to hear an update on, whether it's the uh, the Commission for Renewing Church, or an update on ELCA World Hunger or whatever it might be, that is a really helpful opportunity, and a place to kind of vent and ask questions, and just share frustrations. And I think that part of the conversation stayed civil,
mhm.
but there was a chance for people to complain a little bit in an appropriate way about what they see or don't see. Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic use of the space, even though I recognize that it's not officially your job, and yet you're willing to put yourself out there in that regard, and I think that's fantastic.
And I like the venting too. I mean, when you're talking about venting, I'm a layperson. Before I started asking questions on Facebook and doing Q&As, I didn't know half the issues with clergy. I mean,
Hmm.
I literally had no idea. I'm in the Southeastern Synod. We don't have a clergy shortage where I am,
Hmm.
but I go to some other things and people are, saying that the whole thing is coming down, right? Because clear shortage. And then I learned about all these things that, in certain synods, they have churches that are willing to pay guidelines and stuff, and they can't find a pastor to do it. And it's like, oh, I would have no idea if I wasn't open to people venting about things. So
Yeah.
I like hearing that too. I
Hmm.
mean, to a point, just don't call me any names. We'll be fine.
Well, and I'll tell you, I think your background, we talked before about your role, you're outside of the church, you're in labor law.
Mhm.
And our ministers are, our ordained clergy, our laborers within the church. Hopefully, less and less will we depend on them for all the work of the church, but we've been doing that for a very long time, and making sure their needs are met, whether it's retirement or being able to pay their student loans. It's really important, and it seems like you're well placed to help listen to those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people don't really think about, even in their own congregations, how their pastors get paid, right? We just went through a call process. We just called the pastor. She's going to start this upcoming Sunday. But most of the people, they may hear, okay, we've offered whatever this. So they hear it once and then they completely forget about it. And then they have no idea what's going on or pay attention to it. They just know, well, someone's paying the pastor and they're staying, so everything is fine.
Right.
But they
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, a lot of people don't know. Does that fit with standards? I mean, where do the standards come from? A lot of people just don't really think about it, which
Right.
is kind of a shame, but it's just the reality that we're in.
But more and more congregations in the denomination are thinking about it because they're not able to get a pastor.
Right.
Right.
So it just keeps coming up.
Yeah, but you're right though. I think that that transition in pastoral leadership sometimes is sometimes the closest that a layperson in a congregation will come to their interaction with the wider church, because that next pastor is coming from somewhere. They received their education somewhere. Their benefits are getting paid, by the congregation, but they're being provided by someone outside of the congregation, predominantly through Portico. So that's where if for especially folks that really don't have much of any sense about the wider church outside of the four walls of their own congregation, that's when that sense that becomes a little bit more perceived.
So how's your experience been in this role? How have you liked it? You've been there 2 years, possibly there for another 10.
I haven't decided if I'm going to go for another term or not, but so far I've equated it to drinking from a fire hose, right?
That's the Holy Spirit.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. But also, I mean, there were things I didn't even know existed, right? Wings of the Churchwide organization, which I was unaware about. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that makes sense. And also, this person is fantastic and they're doing an incredible job. One of the things I think that we fall down upon a lot is we feel it's beneath us to promote ourselves. So the Churchwide office does so much good work and there's so many good people in it, but we don't kind of blow our horn about it enough, so that people that are in the pews think that, they're just skimming from the top and not doing anything, and dressed in fancy robes or something, but there's a lot of good stuff going on. And that's the thing I've been learning. These 2 years have been a learning experience for me to know what's been going on in the church. And then, for church council, people are there that are giving their time and money. I mean, church council isn't getting paid for their work. The only people on church council that get paid are the presiding bishop, the secretary, and the treasurer. The rest of us are doing it for, as a volunteer basis, right? So, and this is, I mean, it's not a minuscule amount of work, right? There's a lot of reading, and then they've got to kind of, you're making decisions on behalf of the church, but you don't hear complaints about it. I mean, people are willing to do this work, and it's inspiring to see how many people are just, willing to do the work of God in our church. So those are the things that's really bolstered me, that I've been going through for these years, and just seeing kind of what the Churchwide organization does, how it helps synods, how it helps congregations in ways that we don't tell people, but we should.
Can you think of an example or two?
I mean,
I don't necessarily want to out individuals, but something that an office has accomplished.
So, one of the things that we do a lot is, disaster stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, Lutheran disaster response is actually part of the Service and Justice home area in the ELCA. And so many times when there's a disaster, and down where I am in the Southeastern Synod, there's a hurricane that hits Mississippi or Savannah, or if there's tornadoes that go through Tennessee, Lutheran disaster response is right there helping our disaster response team in trying to get people, funds, organizational structure stuff. And they're essential. I mean, without LDR, it'd be a lot harder to get this stuff done. So that's one of the examples. And a lot of people don't think about it. Don't think, oh, that's part of the churchwide organization. It's one of those things where like, oh yeah, there's a Lutheran disaster response. That's a good group of people, and they don't put it together. That's actually part of your ELCA. That's the churchwide office that is doing something in support of congregations and neighborhoods in which those congregations reside in. So that's one example, I think, which is where you see the churchwide office helping folks. And there's a lot of training. I was just in Chicago, I want to say 2 weeks ago. They're starting a Latina young leader training, and they had Latina young leaders from across the country coming to Chicago to learn about ways to be leaders in their communities, in their congregations, and how their congregations can help their communities and how the church can help them. And this was the first year. So the head of the Latina desk, Pastor Hector Carrasquilla, wants this to grow every year. And so the one thing that was kind of interesting is, and I appreciate this, it was almost all done in Spanish. So they have to have a translator for me and for folks that don't speak Spanish that well, or at least, can't understand it when it's said that fast. But, these are little things that are being done that people might not notice are being done. And it might be, some people might say, well, it's kind of small, and well, yeah, but a lot of this stuff takes a lot of organizational time, a lot of money to get off the ground. And so some of these things may start small, but they're building, they're putting seeds in the ground. So those are two examples that just came off the top of my head.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that bridges us over to what challenges do you see that our church is attempting to meet, and what are the big I guess the 30,000-foot things that we can do to meet them at that level?
Well, so that's the fun thing. Like when you ask people, what are the challenges of the church? And I've asked various questions of this. People will come up with, 100 different things, right? But some of the big ones, we've touched on a little bit. There are congregations that don't have pastors and have been waiting for a while, and they don't know what to do. And they get frustrated because they can't get a pastor. There are congregations that feel isolated, that they don't have enough help because either A, they're rural, or B, they speak Spanish and they're in a space where kind of they feel they're by themselves because guess what? The website isn't in Spanish, right? The ELCA website is in Spanish. They don't have resources in Spanish. There are people who feel, that they're disconnected from everything because there's a synod above them that does stuff, and there's an ELCA above that, but they don't know how to get, say, grants from ELCA that's going down because their synod isn't telling them how to go about doing that or isn't batting for them. A lot of these things, it's because things are a lot disconnected. And I've spoken about this in a few different areas, and I think I may have spoken about it to the clergy in Lower Susquehanna where Keith was there. But the ELCA is a compromise organization, right? When it started, there were 3 different groups, but there were 2 big main ones that have different ways of doing church, and they jammed them both together, and they didn't want the other to win. So,
and we dealt with some of that in the deacons episode. That's sort of what happened with deacons and Ames and all that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of them was more hierarchical, one of them was more congregational, and so they said, let's be a little bit hierarchical, but let's be congregational as well. And if you have, do anything, obviously it's gonna not make sense later down the line. So
Right.
35 years down the line, we're like, why in the world is that being done? It's because, because back then they decided this made sense to make everyone happy. I don't know. One of the issues that I kind of see is that people in the pews seem to believe it's more hierarchy than it actually is, right?
Hmm.
Bishops are very limited in what they can do. Bishop Eaton is very limited in what she can do. She likes to say, I am not a pope, and I'm glad I'm not a pope. But, a lot of people seem to think that she can just say, okay, you know, pastor in this area, boop, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Right.
And so I've thought, and, that my personal idea is that we should make the reality match the perception. There should be a little bit more authority up the line. There should be a little bit more structure together. And there are some synods that are doing some wonderful things with pastoral shortages. There are some synods that are grouping congregations together, and they're saying, okay, you have 6 congregations, you have 2 pastors, 2 deacons, and they're going to travel among them, group them together. There are, different ideas about, and I've brought this up, whereas, kind of the idea of you don't need to have a pastor to be a functioning congregation. You
Hmm.
know, in the beginning eras of like the US, right? Out west, that you'd go months without seeing a pastor, and congregations would have to do the work themselves, and they'd wait for the traveling pastor to come by and do what the traveling pastor needed to do. And so part of this is also, in my opinion, there's a systemic devaluation of lay leadership in the ELCA, right? We think pastors need to do everything. Pastors, are the boss. We need to run everything by the pastor, even if it doesn't apply to kind of things in their bailiwick. And so this is something that's infected some pastors because they want to be in charge of everything, and it's infected some congregations. So pastors who want to say, "Hey, you're the congregation," get pushed into doing more than they think they should because the congregation is like, "No, that's your job." And so we have to rethink that. That's a systemic thing. We have to rethink that. Whereas congregations exist based on, they can exist as the membership of the congregation. The pastor kind of slides into the role and is not necessarily, doesn't make or break the congregation. It works with the congregation. So laity and clergy need to work together and figure those things out. Now, on the other hand, it's easy to say if you're in a place where it gets a regular pastor every time you get an opening, right? If you're in an urban center or something. But we do need to rethink some of this stuff. Also, you see numbers at a seminary are much lower than they have been in the past. So it's going to require some really interesting thought processes, but it's also going to require a difference in how we see how we're connected to the other expressions of the church. So these things, multi-point stuff, only works when a synod has an authority to make those constructions happen, right?
Hmm.
If the church organization has a little bit more authority, maybe they can help in restructuring some of those things. I know people get mad at me a little bit for this, some because they really like their congregational viewpoint. I've seen enough issues with congregational stuff where I kind of like the more, more of an Episcopalian type of, hierarchical view. But I think that's going to be something that we have to think about because, we exist among other groups, other congregations together. We're not, we are congregations, but sometimes we have bought into the mentality that the congregation 2 miles down the road is our competition as opposed to our friend.
Right.
Right. And I think this all ties into it. And I think that if we kind of have a little bit more authority up the ladder, it might allow for a more, we're working together on this as opposed to we need to do this alone. I remember when I was just a synod council member and I would go in somewhere, I went in somewhere who wasn't giving mission support because their pastor asked me to come in. And I said, okay, I asked what are some of the issues, and someone said, well, feels like we're redoing things, we're reinventing the wheel every time we do stuff. why can't the synod tell us what to do about these things? And I said, well, there's these people, this person you can reach out. It's like, well, yeah, but I have to reach out to them. Why don't they just tell me, sort of thing. And it's like, kind of a weird thing where it's like, this is an other group that needs to come to us, as opposed to feeling like we're all together working for the same goal. And so it's going to take a change in mentality, and it's going to take a change in kind of how we see our own little congregation amongst a great mass of Lutheran Christianity.
What have you heard, Imran, and or thought about, say, the number of synods that the ELCA has? Because you're talking about that structure in this moment. I think that might be an interesting next piece.
So I haven't heard, I don't know where they're going with. So I'll just start off by saying, and I'll answer the question, but I'll start off by saying that the Church Council and CRLC are not really in conversation with each other right now,
right,
on purpose, right? Mm-hmm. Because we want the CRLC to be independent. We don't want to put our thumb on anything. We get updates, right, from the chairs, but we don't know kind of what they're working towards. We'll know in our meeting this November, because they're going to present their findings. Yeah. So we know a little bit what they're talking about. We don't know what they're going to go with. The synod question is very interesting. And one of the issues with the synod thing, of course, you might know, is that in the Constitution, it says exactly what the boundaries of each synod are. Mm. So someone decided to make that a constitutional thing as opposed to like a bylaw or something.
Right.
That makes it really hard to change, first of all. Secondly, one of the issues is, if you change the synods, how do you reallocate resources? Because synods have been helping out certain congregations. If you take away a certain congregation and put it in another synod, will people freak out? We've been paying for this for how many years? And now, I mean, that's part of the same idea of, this is our congregation and that's their congregation, our synod, their synod.
Right.
I mean, I don't know if it's a little different in a state like Pennsylvania where you are, where synods are right next to each other. Mm-hmm. Down here in the Southeast, it feels a little bit more disconnected because we're talking about states. And so our nearest synod are also, so we have Florida Bahamas Synod to the south of us. We have South Carolina Synod. We have North Carolina Synod. And they're, the political boundaries make it feel more, like this is a good boundary to have, sort of thing. Not that we're not close with each other in Region 9 or anything like that, but just it may be different when the synods are smaller. And I imagine, like, for example, Minneapolis area synod and St. Paul area synod might have a different view on, sharing things with synod wise mm-hmm. than maybe a bigger synod would. So the other issue is going to be, how big do you make these synods? Southeastern Synod is already pretty long. Our Bishop Kevin Strickland, has put like hundreds of thousands of miles on the car already in 4 years. I think he put like 200,000 miles on it. Do you really want your bishop to be on the road that much? Right. And I mean, almost, you see him on Facebook, he's here, he's there. It's like, do you have any time to decompress or to be with your family? These are important questions. I mean, what do you do about that? And then travel budget, goes up. And then what would our synods look like? So all of these, so once you start asking the question, you almost have to go back to the beginning and be like, all right, so how do we do these sort of things? Right. So I will say there was an interesting conversation, and it was with your bishop, Keith, Bishop Dunlap. Mm-hmm. We were at a church council meeting. He was filling in as a liaison bishop. And we were asked by the Commission for a Renewed Lutheran Church, come up with some, out there ideas. And so his thought was, what was it? It was 10 synods, 50 bishops. The concept was you'd have a synod, but you'd have multiple bishops in the synod, and the bishops would act as like a pastor of the pastors, right? Or like someone in a pastoral role. And maybe you'd have a separate person for administration.
Okay.
right? Like, because a lot of bishop work is admin, right? So maybe you have a separate person from administration and the rest of the bishops are there to be pastoral in those areas.
Hmm.
Then I thought about this and said, well, what about this too? What if we take all of the pastors and have them be employees of the synod?
Mhm.
That way, everyone gets paid guidelines. That way, all the pastors can organize in a union and bargain for fairer wages or conditions. That way, congregations might get more pastors, than they would otherwise, right? Because pastors can be paid well and also go to some place which may not have that much money.
Mhm.
Now, of course, this might, some people might get scared. Well, we might have less pastors. We have 4 pastors, we might get 3, or something like that. Or they might try to close our church. I mean, these are concerns that are valid, but these sort of ideas or thought processes, like, what do we want our synods to be?
Mhm.
What do we want our bishops to be? I think are the primary questions we need to ask, and not just say, oh, well, let's go to 50 synods just because we think it's better. I mean, I think we need to really rethink the whole middle management level if we're going to go.
Right.
So it seems like moving resources to the region level would make sense too.
Yeah, I mean, it could.
I think
I
our
mean,
regions used to be more developed than they are now.
yeah, that's the other thing. The regions are kind of not as developed, but that's another. So especially out of COVID, right? A lot of synods are keeping more money in. That affects the regions as much as it affects churchwide budget,
Mhm.
right? So that's another way where people are looking inward as opposed to, say, looking at the entire church together, right? And so these are things we need to kind of open up, and regions are one of those things I didn't even know about until I was elected vice president of a synod, right? I heard of regions, I had no idea what they were, right? And I
Mhm.
know had no idea what region we were in.
Yeah.
um,
Well, because you are a region.
Right.
well,
most
yeah,
most regions are about the size of your synod. So,
right, yeah. Our region that currently in our region right now is the was it goes from Virginia all the way down to Florida. So
well, to the Caribbean.
yeah, to the Caribbean. That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mhm.
And all the way to Mississippi then.
all the way to Mississippi. Yeah.
So, yeah. As far as diversity, we've talked a little bit about that with Latina and such, but I know that's been a sort of a focus that we've had, diversity. My challenge is how do we get more diverse without rolling into our sort of colonialism, essentially? I think generally when we think of evangelism, we think of bringing people into the pews and making them part of our tribe. And that doesn't seem like a good model for diversity.
Yeah. And so we had that issue, right? We started off by saying we want 10% of people of color in the LCA, and there was no movement on that. And it almost felt like it was a goal and no one did anything with it. It was
Right.
like, yeah, we like this number and we're just going to put this in here, but we're not going to actually do anything about it. A friend of mine is a African American pastor here in Atlanta, and she was saying, when she was growing up, it was the Missouri Synod had a lot more mission churches in the South and in black areas than the ELCA did, and so, or the ELCA predecessor bodies. So they are slightly more diverse than we are. But one of the things is they actually cared enough to put money into doing mission in areas that are majority black. So one of the things that it requires, if we want to be more diverse, is to actually put money behind it, right? And then, I mean, it sounds a little crass to say, well, money you need to spend, but I mean that's true. I mean, you can't expect to have more diverse population if you don't fund missions in those areas, right? If you want more black folks or Latino folks or Asian folks, you need to actually go into those communities and you need to have congregations there for them. I mean, because I think we have a really important message as Lutherans. Like, we have a message of grace, and you hear this message from a lot of, I should say, law focused Christian denominations that are very judgmental or very, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. God's not going to love you unless you do XYZ,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we have a message that is much more, God is doing the work. You're not doing the work. God loves you already. You know, you don't have to do anything in order to make God love you. And I think that's a very powerful message, but we've confined it into certain areas, right? And we've seen ourselves as Lutheran as being either German or Scandinavian. Like that's our culture. And a lot of times, so it's kind of funny. I spoke about this after I got elected. I was ushered into a back room, a green room at the stage in Columbus, and we talked. And there was a Living Lutheran article about it. And one of the things I mentioned that didn't make it to the Living Lutheran article was how everything in the LCA seems to be, or a lot of things in the LCA seem to be culturally focused on Northern European stuff, right? People make jokes about Jello and hot dish, and I was like, what in the world is hot dish, right? And I just had hot dish for the first time last year in Minnesota, but I was like, why? Like, kind of Garrison Keillor-esque, you might be a Lutheran if blah blah blah,
Folk
sort of
bands and all that. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so I don't think people realize. I mean, it's fun and it's a joke and it's how, but I don't think people realize how much it kind of turns off folks that aren't in that culture. They feel like they have to be knowledgeable about Midwestern stuff in
Right.
order to be a Lutheran. And we haven't made that distinction apparent. Like, this is a fun thing that a lot of Midwesterners who are ELCA people do, but you don't have to know this to be a Lutheran. Because, feeling like an outsider in your own church is not going to be helpful. And so that's kind of an issue that exists. And I wonder if that prevents, kind of missions from going into different areas of the country, right? We like to say, like in the Southeast, we're very different than a lot of other Lutherans in terms of, like, our synod is a very progressive synod. And people get kind of confused because they're like, oh, you're in the Southeast. They're like, yeah, but a lot of our folks have chosen to join this church, right? For the things that the church stands for, the church believes in. There's not as much of people maybe that have been there this for X generations going back XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, I should say that there are a lot of Black Lutherans that have had generations of Black Lutherans in their family who still get asked, when did you become Lutheran, right?
Mm-hmm.
The head of Service and Justice, his name is Pastor Khalid al-Yatim. He's from Palestine. He gets asked, when did you become a Christian? And his response, I mean, he gets frustrated, but his response has been, since the day of Pentecost.
Right.
Which is a good answer, but
Yeah.
I mean, there's kind of this idea of you have to be a certain way to be a Lutheran Christian. And it may not be stated outright, but it comes up. And so that's an issue. I will say that the number of people of color in the ELCA has risen now to 6%. And the reason for that is because white Lutherans have left as opposed to a lot more people of color Lutherans. But the idea is, where are you prioritizing? And where are you sending mission funds, and who are you speaking to? And so if we want to get more diverse, we need to actually kind of speak to people in ways that they're at. And we need to actually, identify with people and their pain, their hurt. I was the ADLA convention, was the African Descent Lutheran Association, was here in Atlanta last year. I think it was last year or 2022. But, one of the things is, people have experienced harm in the church and experienced, kind of minimizing or put down in the church. And a lot of it comes down to, they don't feel like they've been listened to or taken seriously. And that's kind of like where you start from. Let's listen to what your concerns are, take them seriously, try to actually rectify them and do something with them, as opposed to a Dropbox that has like a bottom that's open, right?
Right.
And so that also applies. I mean, that's a race issue, but it also applies to youth, right? And young adults. Like, one of the things is great, like the youth gathering just happened this summer. But one of the things that comes up a lot is this is fantastic. Youth, young adults feel heard. They feel like they're part of the church. Then they go back home, and all of a sudden they're closed off from their church doesn't value them as much as say the youth gathering did, right? And then
or there just aren't that many of them.
Yeah,
that's the experience of my son. He's he felt all alone as a teenager in his church, and then goes to the youth gathering where and he's with a group from a couple other congregations, and then he's back home again. And
yeah. What do you do, right?
Exactly.
And then, I mean, we still have the issue with gender as well, right? Female pastors still get treated terribly in a lot of situations. You still have congregations that say we don't want a woman pastor, right? I mean, even with in some of the stuff Bishop Eaton could tell you about the stuff she's been things that have been said to her would make you squirm. I mean, like we still have a long way to go there. We've gone farther, I think, on gender than a lot of the other issues, but still, I mean, there's still ways to go. And I think we need to kind of say, we still need to listen to women, right? That and take their concerns seriously. They feel uncomfortable in certain ways. We need to actually kind of think about that. And then there are also one of the things that I've heard a lot is, people with disabilities feel like, they don't really matter in the church. Churches are old. They don't have ramps sometimes. And, and they get told, well, we don't have the money, sorry, or people who have issues with listening. My church currently has, an aging sound system. So if someone has a problem with hearing,
right,
they're a little out of luck. I mean, and it's one of those things where, what are we doing to help folks? And where are we spending the money on folks that have issues with hearing or with seeing? So a lot of these questions are, where's our money? Where's our focus? Who are we listening to? Who are we talking?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, thank you for that. We're gonna address another set of things in the next episode. So we're gonna keep talking, but we'll come back in a couple weeks here for all you listeners. Well, this has been a great conversation with Imran Siddiqui. We are cutting this conversation into two pieces, and the remainder of that conversation will happen in episode 22. You've heard enough of us today, and we thank you so much for that. So let's move on to the catechism questions. On our last episode, in episode 20, our question was, what book of the Bible speaks positively about gender diverse people? The options were Jonah, Matthew, Ecclesiastes, and Revelation. The answer is Matthew 19:12, which talks about eunuchs.
Indeed it does. Question for this week then. In the year 325 CE, the Common Era, Christian bishops met for the Council of Nicaea to hammer out agreement on fundamental beliefs of Christians. What was the result of this meeting? Your answer options are A, the Nicene Creed, B, that Arius, Theonas, and Secundus were excommunicated from the church and exiled, C, that there were the creation of 20 new church laws, or D, the rescheduling of Easter.
Yeah, so if you come up with an answer for that one might be a bit tricky for you. You can contact us by email, our social media, or even our phone number that are all in the episode notes. Main Street Lutherans is hosted by Keith Fair and Ben Fote, and the show is produced by Fote Media Productions. Find all of our contact information, links, and a transcript in those episode notes. Until next time, go in peace, serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.